Good morning, everyone. My name is Ann Waldorf. I'm a clinical psychologist with the Department of Psychiatry here at the School of Medicine at the University of New Mexico. I first started working with the community reinforcement approach in the spring of 1990. So I've had a lot of opportunity to see it applied and in different settings. It is the approach that I most consistently use when I work with patients who have substance use disorders, and also the approach I work with regard to families. We're going to talk a little bit today about the community reinforcement approach, how it came to be, what we have seen with regard to empirically validated studies. We'll talk a little bit about the modifications that were made to CRA when it was first applied to the treatment of adolescents. That also is called CRA, but adolescent CRA. And we will touch briefly on what's called community reinforcement approach and family training, which is basically a modality that we have been able to use with individuals who have a loved one who is somewhat resistant to treatment. And it's a way to interact with them to help either get that person into treatment or at least put the significant other in a place that they're not quite so overwhelmed by having a substance user as part of the family. So, I'm new to this format, so I will sort of charge forward. If there are specific questions, though, that people have in the midst, given that we have a little bit of time, I don't mind being interrupted. I don't know how that works, but
yes. So if people want to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself. And you can unmute yourself by taking your mouse and moving it to the bottom left side of your Zoom screen. And there's a little speaker there, and you just click it. If there's a line over it, that means you're muted. And if there's not a line, that means you're unmuted. If you're on the phone, you press *6 to unmute yourself. And if anything else, just send a chat and we'll answer it as we go, okay?
Everybody good? And you'll see me looking to the side. I have my notes to the side on my computer, but I'm not just reading my email or something. Okay. So first of all, let me give you a little bit of the history of the community reinforcement approach. It's really a blending of operant conditioning, for those of you who have studied behavior therapies, that's B.F. Skinner's work, and social learning theory, not as often taught, but or as robustly, but still very, very important. That's the work of Albert Bandura. With operant conditioning, the belief is that if we have a behavior that is reinforced, then it tends to be repeated. And if it's not reinforced, then it tends to weaken. And that's how you train all sorts of creatures, your pets, your children. Your children eventually start training us the same way. So that's the idea behind the reinforcement approach. Social learning theory says basically that behavior's formed not in a vacuum, that it's in a reciprocal manner with flow going backwards and forwards, with influence from your own cognitions, your behaviors, the behaviors of other people, and the environment in which you live. Now, there's a couple of reasons that this is different than what were the models of the time. The model really started in the 1970s, and at that time, the major way that people were treating substances was with a 12-step model, and that certainly has profound impact on people's lives and has done so much good for so many people. But theoretically, it was divergent from the community reinforcement approach in that within CRA, there was no sense of higher power. There was no sort of a sense of moral or spiritual component. It doesn't mean that those can't be components, but that it was not a required component. So that was really a shift from where we had been in the treatment at the time. So what is the goal of CRA? Nate Azrin is the person who is really determined to be the founder, if you will. He worked with another student, a graduate student named Hunt, who unfortunately died very early on in the process of this model evolving. So ACRA is the name that you usually see associated with that. The goal of CRA, basically, I'm just going to read this to you because I think it's important enough to not paraphrase, is to rearrange the vocational, family, and social reinforcers of the substance users such that a time out from these reinforcers would occur if he or she began to use. ACRA's quote said that's because it was normed initially on male alcohol users. So this is really the context in which this phrase is written. And what does that mean? That means basically you try to create an environment with the substance user in which they get more reinforcement for not using than they do for using. It sounds fairly simplistic, but it can be amazingly powerful. Okay, so what are the general goals? Well, we actually have goals for both clients and concerned significant others. If you look, first of all, just to the left column, the goals for clients almost always are abstinence. Now, I put in a long run with regard to abstinence because oftentimes if you start with you need to quit drinking and never drink again, or whatever your drug of choice is, that doesn't engage people very well. But even if you were to see somebody doing CRA and it looked like they were doing mostly harm reduction, it doesn't mean that the long-term goal is not abstinence. It just merely means that that is farther out into the future than what we may be working on in that particular setting. Another goal for clients with regard to CRA is the idea that it is important for them to have pro-social activities. Oftentimes, by the time a client gets to us, what we see is that almost all of their social activities in some ways revolve around the substance use. So in order to find non-using reinforcing, we have to find pro-social activities that they find rewarding. Sometimes it's things they used to do and they've dropped out of doing. Sometimes it means actually helping them find new activities that give them pleasure and social contact. Another goal for client is positive relationships with family and friends. What that looks like is going to be different for each individual based on sort of where they are in their own process, what the family dynamics are. Sometimes positive relationships mean you get closer to family members. Sometimes, depending on the use patterns of the family members, we help them have a positive relationship, but maybe not quite so focused on the family. And then finally, for the client, we're really looking for meaningful occupational and vocational activities. So it doesn't mean somebody has to work per se, but purposeful activity other than finding, using, recovering from drugs and alcohol has got to be an integral part of their treatment. With regard to concerned significant others, and that can be, we're pretty broad in what constitutes a concerned significant other. When I was working, applying CRA with homeless substance users, one person, the only individual in their life who really cared about them and checked in on them was the person who they rented their post office box from. And with the patient's permission, we actually included that individual in the therapy process. And what we were trying to do, we teach the concerned significant others how to effectively engage with the patient in a way, or the client in a way that is going to feel a lot different. We're really trying to move away from the nagging standpoint or the shaming standpoint, and how to help them understand ways to talk to someone who's trying to decrease and ultimately end their use in a manner that's supportive. In the same way, we're pretty broad in our definitions of family. It's what do you believe your family is, and we'll work with you on that. What CRA is not is confrontational. So there certainly are models where the belief is that if you confront the substance users with their behavior and the impact of of what those behaviors are doing within the family system or the vocational system, that will be the motivator to get them to treatment. What we know about confrontational models is certainly for some individuals, they do work in the long run, but their efficacy tends to be in getting someone to treatment. But the data for 6 months, a year, 2 years out is not nearly as robust as getting them in. One criticism of the community reinforcement is that we're just too nice. We're not tough enough. We're not demanding enough to our patients and clients. That is absolutely a misconception. We try to be kind, but we definitely do hold clients accountable. There are boundaries. There are consequences if behaviors are not followed. We encourage significant others to set boundaries and stick to them. So, but we also are of a belief that harshness is not a necessary component for improvement. The other thing that I also really like about the community reinforcement approach is it's not a one-size-fits-all. There is a basic structure that is applied to all individuals, but my CRA and someone else's CRA may look entirely different depending on if I'm the substance user, depending on where I am and what my needs are. What CRA offers is what we call a treatment package. And so if you think of CRA in sort of terms of building a house, we might have the same exterior on every house on the block. That provides the framework. But inside, we really will tailor it to the need of the specific patient, because what we know is the more individualized the treatment plan can be, the more likelihood it will be something that is followed specifically by the patient and the people who are supporting them. So just to talk very, very briefly about what the results are with regard to CRA, the first empirical study was done in the early 1970s. It was normed on not uncommon for the time, normed on a male population who were alcohol abusing, who were in an inpatient treatment. So that's different from where most of us practice, but it was a starting place for CRA. The CRA component was compared to what had been the treatment as usual, the control group, which was sort of psychoeducation about what happens with drinking, and then a 12-step supportive model. At 6 months after the treatment, you can read this, I don't have to go step by step, but what you'll see, of course, is in all 4 areas that were reviewed, time spent drinking, time unemployed, away from home, and institutionalized, the CRA individuals did significantly better, not just clinically significantly, but statistically significantly better than the control group, which was education and AA only. The second published study was in 1976, 3 years later. Again, similar types of findings, magnitudes varied slightly, but still significant differences in the groups, with CRA having a much better outcome. One thing that made this study different than the ones that had happened before, the one that had happened 3 years earlier, is that these results were actually maintained at 2 years. And for any of you who treat substance users, one of the things you know is that to have something happen and be present at 6 months and then still present 18 months later is definitely a significant improvement. Hold on just a second and I'll switch my notes here. And then more recently in 1982, a study was done. This is very important because it actually uses a medical assisted treatment. And since this is the Matt Echo, I thought it would be appropriate for you to know that while CRA is a psychosocial intervention, the utilization of disulfiram was introduced as early as 1982, and they found the effectiveness of that. There's actually a complete framework in which you present the utilization of medication-assisted treatment You teach the significant other how to reinforce the use of that. We are now utilizing that same sort of approach with methadone and disulfiram and some of the newer drugs. The other thing is that that particular study did indeed notice the impact of the spouse's role in treatment. And at that time, all the spouses were female because it was still just male alcohol abusers. What we see later in 82 and beyond is some different samples and different populations to include other types of addictions, effectiveness with adolescents, and the study in which I took part was actually the Smith, Myers, and Delaney study, which was started in 1990, and that was effectiveness with homeless substance users, many of whom people had thought there was just no way that we were going to see anybody get better. And we just found consistent benefit with regard to the application of CRA. The study that included adolescents, that was actually normed here in Albuquerque, working with homeless adolescent substance users, and still found very effective results in using this model. So Nate Asrin said, and I believe, that the brain can be reprogrammed, but you just have to be deliberate about it. So what does that mean exactly in pragmatic terms? Well, those are the terms that make up the core concepts of CRA. So what are they? First of all, CRA is always positive and it's always enthusiastic. And that's where people sometimes think we're just nice, but we try to be nice, but we try to be positive and forward thinking as opposed to critical. So it's strategic niceness, I guess, if you will. We also use very simple, very straightforward language. Yes, you see things like CSO, or sometimes you'll see IP, that's the identified patient. Those are all about language for us to use, not for us to use with the patient. The third thing, concept within CRA, is the idea that it is very, very flexible, and that's where I was talking about earlier. There are some basic structures, but then we really tailor it to the individual that we're working with. There is a significant role of meaningful reinforcers for that individual. Sometimes in other types of approaches, we believe we know what's meaningful for a patient and we don't really ask them. But what is a reinforcer to me may indeed be a just arduous, awful task for someone else. So finding meaningful reinforcers specifically for that individual. The other, another core component is the idea that learning new skills with practice must occur first in session and then needs to be practiced between sessions. Not unlike a lot of other cognitive behavioral therapies, much of the work does happen with the patient outside of the session, within their own environment, with the check back and the rehearsal and the obstacles and some refinement happening in the session. The other thing we believe is that it's very important to include the people who are important to the client in the treatment, and there are specific ways to include them, and we believe also that there are skills that those individuals can learn as well. So what is a core component? There are four major core components to community reinforcement approach. The first is what we call the functional analyses, and we can use those both for the substance using behavior and the non-using behavior. And basically what that is it is our attempt to help the client understand what is the function of substances in their life. For somebody who's an opiate addict, they may truly say to you, I want to quit, but they don't. For the function of the opiates may be to ward off horrible withdrawal. For others people, it may be that they have profound trauma histories, and without having trauma treatment, the substance used to quell or avoid or dissociate oneself from the strong emotional occurrences that they're experiencing. We also, though, can do functional analyses of non-using behavior. What makes something reinforcing? Now, the benefit of this is if somebody likes to do bike riding and we do the function analysis of that and say, well, what's the function of that? People would go, oh, well, it's the exercise. Well, maybe not. Maybe we find out the function of bike riding, it's the only time that they talk to people, or it's the only time that they're away from their office or they're out of their house. And so that begins to tell us what is reinforcing for this patient and how it is that we might be able to apply that function, but looking at other behaviors that could do that. The second component of the CRA is what we call the happiness scale. And there are happiness scales that you can find. I mean, you can Google happiness scale and you'll find many. We have a particular one we use. I'll show you an example of that coming up. Basically, this is a snapshot of where the person is in their lives in some key areas and how happy they are with how they're existing right now. It's an important component because it tells us where they are and it gives us an idea of what it is that is important to them. From the happiness scale, we then move into a form called the goals of treatment. It's going to look a little different than the goals of treatment that you see in some of your structured public settings. Can still be incorporated into some of the formats that we are required to do through state or federal agencies. What you'll see is that the happiness scale and the goals of treatment exactly align. So we set each goal based on where that person is on a particular category. The other thing that we know that is specifically important is skills training. We're asking people to do things that they may have never done, or asking people to do things they haven't done in a long time, socialize without substances, face their fears without substances. I mean, the list is endless, and I'm sure lots of you have examples that you can think of right off the top of your head. So we can't ask them to do that without teaching them how to do that. So skills training is another significant component. And then the last one, which I actually forgot to say, is the idea that significant others are significant and they have a very powerful role, particularly true with adolescents, because both the significant others with regard to parents, but also friends, because of the impact of beginning social structures happening in the adolescent's life. And if we're taking away the substances, we're oftentimes taking away all of their significant others simultaneously. Questions so far? All right. The only problem is I can't tell if you're sleeping, so, but I'll assume that you're not. Okay. The triangle, which is represented here, really is just a graphic format of what we're talking about, starting with the functional analysis, finding out why the person drinks, what's the reinforcer of that, going to how they are in their lives right now, what's going well for them, what's not going well for them, and then where would they like to be and how can we help them get there. So let's look specifically at some of these components. The functional analysis, as I said, is basically a roadmap. And for those of you, again, who have been schooled in cognitive behavior therapies, it's an ABC, it's an antecedent behavior consequent map. It can, as I said before, be used both for a problem behavior or a fun, healthy behavior. And I'll explain why that's important in just a moment. So I know this is a little small, I apologize. So this is the functional analysis for the substance use behavior. Again, the first column is what are the external triggers, what's cueing you up to use. Second column, what are the internal triggers? Oh my gosh, I'm so nervous. I'm going out with friends. I don't know how to talk to people. I think I'll just smoke a little doobie before I go. What does it look like? What do you usually use? Do you like all substances equally? Do you have a preference for one particular substance? How much do you use? How long a period do you use? The fourth column is probably the one that takes most people off guard. And that is because we actually ask the patient or the client, what are the short-term positive consequences of use? What do you get out of this? And I've had colleagues say, well, aren't you sort of encourage them to think about why they don't want to quit? And my response is, they already know why they don't want to quit. But if we can identify what it does for them, then we also have to be able to help them identify other ways to have those same sort of rewards from something other than substances. Then the last column is the long-term, not so good things, which are really almost always negative consequences. And when you're using the functional analysis, you sit right there with them. You help them fill it out. If they have trouble filling it out completely in one session, ask them to take it home, bring it back. This is something you really do together, but you're the guide here. They're going to tell you what all these component parts are. So that is you understanding. We don't just take, oh, I use because I'm an addict. No, we do all sorts of things, even as addicts, that we continue to use because it does something for us. And we have to figure out why. Because if we don't, and we ask them to quit, but we don't meet those needs in another healthier way, it's really a setup for the relapse. With regard to treatment planning, as I said, there are two parts of that. One is the happiness scale, and then the other are the goals of counseling. But again, you're using a positive approach. You say, you do some knowledge-based work to find out what they have lost, but we can't assume that what they've lost was important to them. They have to tell us what it is that they want. They have to tell us what they have that they like, what they don't have that they would like to get in the future. And again, you keep in mind the client's reinforcers. An example of this is, oftentimes you'll hear it said that if a patient comes in because they're court ordered, then they're not really motivated for treatment. And I don't think that's necessarily true either. Sometimes what's reinforcing is just not have to deal with the law again. Okay, so we can absolutely work with that. And this is an example of the happiness scale. Very basic instructions. You say to the patient, you're gonna circle a number between 1 and 10, which indicates how happy or unhappy you are in these particular areas. I'm asking you to do it for today. Don't think about what you felt like yesterday. Don't anticipate what you might feel like tomorrow. Tell me where you are right here, right now. So it tends to be a very present focus. This is the happiness scale for adults. And what you'll see shortly is that the goals of counseling sheet is based specifically one-to-one matches with these. I'm going to show you the happiness scale for the adult version. I'll then show you the goals of counseling sheet for the adolescents. Just know that the adolescent happiness scale would match them. What you're doing when you present this to the patient is you give them the idea that oftentimes when we've been using a lot of substances, we're actually not very clear about how we feel about any particular area. It also helps them identify what is most important for them to address right here, right now. We may think it's most important for you to get a job. They may think it's most important for me to reestablish some contact with my kids. We don't have the answer for what's best for them. What's best for them is finding something that motivates them to slow and cease the use based on them getting a reinforcer that's important to them. Then you give, the other thing about the happiness scale is that it's repeated over time. So there is a numerical capacity to view how the patient is progressing, which can be really powerful for the patient as well, because they can go, wow, really, I said I was a 3 and now I'm a 7. That's reinforcing for them as they move forward. All right. these are some of the categories on the adolescent scale. You'll see some modifications. Relationship with friends is a big one for the adolescents because of where they are developmentally. We focus on school because we still treat a lot of adolescents who are not working, are still marginally in school or other school activities. We include relationship with a boyfriend, girlfriend, and relationship of parents. So the relationship with significant others really is broadened. So let me show you what a goals of counseling looks like. I'm actually gonna do these. Let me just talk a little bit about setting goals. CRA really had an understanding of what a SMART goal is long before somebody coined that term. The idea is that you're going to set up the goals of treatment based on the happiness scale and where they're moving. You're going to guide the client's selection of a category. And what I mean by that is if you start with everybody's ones, they are likely to get very, very frustrated. So oftentimes what we do is we say, oh no, I want you to, let's start with something where you're a 3. What would it take to get you to a 5? Because that kind of growth is easier to capture early on, and it's reinforcing in and of itself. In general, you set short goals. So what are SMART goals? They are, God, I just forgot the acronym. I know they are short, they are specific, they're measurable, they are agreed upon, right? This is you and the client working together to establish the goals. They are relevant, so it has to be something that is important for the client, not just me, and then it also has to be time limited, so we can go back and find out what's going on. So this is a goals of counseling sheet that matches the happiness scale for an adolescent. Again, you say to the patient, in the area of marijuana use or non-use, I would like to, and he says, use less. So that's where you come in as a guide and say, what does less mean? Is that 1 bowl less than you're smoking currently? Is that no use on the weekends? So you get very specific on what that is. Then you look at what would the intervention be. Well, what do you know? I know if I have it, I smoke it. Okay, so one intervention would be to limit the number of times you buy marijuana throughout the week. Or I had a young man who said, I don't want to quit using the number of bowls, but I'll get a pipe that has half the size of bowl. And I went, excellent, right? So we've already reduced use in half without me going, well, that's a dumb idea. Why don't you just get rid of that dang pipe? So, and then we set the time frame. By when will you get a smaller pipe and to begin to use it? And then you just go down each one of those. Now, obviously, you don't have them do something every week in every category. So that's again where you come in as a guide. Okay, so relationships with your parents are pretty good. They could be a little better. What if we worked on that this week? Another thing that makes this unusual is that people come in thinking that their whole treatment is going to be on their substance use. And what this is, the implication in this is that your substance use is part of a larger whole of who you are and how you function in the world. So again, just to review, guidelines for goal setting, they should be brief, they should be positive. What will be done, that seems like a funny thing to bring up, but what we know is that if you talk to people about what they will and can do, they are much more successful than if we tell them what they can't or won't do. So you say, I will smoke less, as opposed to I have to cut down. Same behavior, framed differently, more palatable for some reason to our brains. right? They have to be specific, very measurable. So again, going back to the less, what does less mean? How do we measure that? How can we tell over time? They also have to be reasonable. I work with a lot of adolescent substance users who have dropped out of school and maybe haven't gotten their GED. And so we'll be talking about what they want to do with regard to vocation. And they say, I want to get a job so that I can get my own apartment. Well, getting a job is a reasonable long-term goal, but it is not going to be a reasonable short-term goal. So then what I would say is, okay, what might you do in this next week to get a job? And they'll say, well, I probably should get my GED first. Excellent. What do you need to do in this next week to work toward GED? Well, I don't even know what classes they offer at the community college. So a reasonable goal for the next week is to check out GED classes at the community college. That's all wrapped up in them getting a job down the road. But if we put it too far out there, there's not going to be enough immediate reinforcement for them to move forward. It also has.
And hey, we have a question from the group. Amber from First Choice Community Healthcare asked, is the goal setting described in conjunction with the treatment plan, or is it used as a substitute to the typical 30 or 90-day treatment plan?
So that's a great question, Amber, because in working at a federally qualified healthcare clinic, you oftentimes have a structure that has to be used for the 30 or 90-day treatment plan. In the best of all possible worlds, this would substitute for that, but because there are check boxes that oftentimes the feds require, then it has to be done, it has to be incorporated into. Does that make sense?
It does, thank you.
Yeah, it's, you know, the good thing about creating clinical protocols outside of real settings is that you can be creative and you can find out what really works. And then the challenge for all of us who practice, particularly in public healthcare settings, is to say, okay, how do I use the richness of this particular process while still making sure when a myriad of reviewers come in that I've checked all the boxes that I need to. But great question.
Yeah, exactly. And I like the concept of the week to week. I think it's more manageable for a lot of our clients.
Right. So like if you have a mandate for a 90-day treatment plan, the 90-day goal could very easily be sign up for GED classes. Mm-hmm. And then the week to week goal may be find out where the classes are offered. The next week is who do I need to call to do that? It might even be that they call with you while they're in for their weekly checkup. And make that. So sometimes people will say, going to this idea that it's under the client's control, they'll say, well, why would you ever have them do that with you in the office? And I want to go, you know, there are lots of systems that I have trouble navigating. And if I'm still withdrawing and living on the streets and only have my Obama phone, which has limited data and calling, that's not necessarily under their control. But
yeah, and the role modeling, a lot of them don't know how to ask the questions or how to kind of communicate it.
Exactly. And when you say role modeling, of course, you're harking back exactly to Bandura's social learning theory, right? That's what it is. We learn by what people are doing in our environment. So great questions. Thank you. Any more, Hannah? Nope. Okay. So I think the last thing I have here is that it's based on skills the client already has. So what does that mean? So Amber just brings that up. Well, what if they don't know how to ask questions? Well, guess what? That's when the skills training comes into play. Oftentimes, people who have been using substances, if they start early enough, they never establish good skills. If they started later, they may have had skills, but they're no longer remembering how to do it. Because why? Skills are nothing more than something that we do and improve on with practice. It's the same thing for us. So, I mean, I'm pretty lucky. I've been in the same job for several years now. But if I had to go out and find a new job, I would have to brush up on my job finding skills. So the idea behind it is that we have to understand, part of our evaluation of the client is understanding how good they are at particular things. And if they don't have those skills, then our job is to help them get those skills. So for example, if somebody says, I use alcohol almost exclusively because I have a hard time talking to people, then what you have to do is you have to teach them how to talk to people. And a lot of that is role playing, and a lot of that is practice in the session. Same thing with problem solving. Now, or anger management. There are lots of cognitive behavioral practices out there that I'm sure many of you already employ that can help patients learn these skills. If not, there are specific models that are embedded in the resource materials that I've listed at the end of the slide, which they get. Hannah, right? The slides are available online after it's over.
Yes. Yep. I send an email afterwards with them.
Okay, perfect. One thing that's a little different than some other models is actual drink and drug refusal skills. And you really just teach them how to say no, but in a little more robust way than the just say no model. This is actually really fun to do in a group with other clients because they will know exactly what will get somebody to agree to drink or use when they have set out not to, and it can be very helpful. And again, it's the practice. And these are well defined in the original CRA book, which I'll tell you what that is when we get to the reference page, but also in some of the other free manuals. There's actually an ACRA treatment manual on the SAMHSA website because SAMHSA recognizes it as one of the empirically based approaches that it endorses, that has all of these skills trainings in there. But if you have a favorite anger management or communication skills that is different than that, that's part of the flexibility, not only for the patient, but for the therapist as well. So I realize I'm running over time, but let me just finish out a couple other points.
Yeah.
The final,
Hello?
yes.
Oh, I finally figured it out. Hannah, this is Athena. I am your Who's Showing Up as video for the last 45 minutes.
That's
I am
okay.
on the reservation,
Thank
and
you.
I have no internet reception.
That's okay. Thank you so much, Athena. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
So one of the things that we talked about was the idea that much of the work that the patient does goes on between sessions, and that is assigning homework. Now, in just like other cognitive behavioral approaches, I would recommend not using the term homework unless it really resonates with somebody. If you have some student who's doing too many drugs or alcohol, but they're really invested in school, maybe homework is a good word for them, but it's not for many of our clients. So you just talk about it as practice or do an experiment. Why don't you just experiment with talking for 15 minutes to somebody in a party before you decide to get alcohol. So practice gathering data, seeing what happens. Those are the kinds of phrases. You offer the rationale for it, right? This isn't mystery. You say, look, here's what we know. If you can start talking and do it for 15 minutes, your anxiety will reduce and you'll see that you don't have to have the alcohol in order to do it. You always get the client's input. This is a very patient-centered approach. And they say, well, here's what happened when I did that the last time. And then you tease that out. And you go, okay, so maybe that setting is not the place to practice. Maybe you don't practice at your wife's work party. Maybe you practice when you go to the gym first, right? So you build up to it. It's agreed upon. It goes back to the SMART goal things. You are getting them to agree to this. You don't assign them something that they haven't helped you come up with. It's also really important to look at what might come up and have some planning for that. The reason that CRA sometimes is accused of being falsely positive and optimistic is if somebody comes into me, so they've set a goal for themselves for the week, they come in and they go, I tried, but I wasn't able to do that. My response is going to be, that's great. Let's talk about why it didn't work, even though you tried. This is data. Now, guess what? If they come in and say, I did it, I tried and was successful, I'm going to go, that's great. Let's figure out how you were able to do that and reinforce them for that. Because I'm not lying, it is true. It's all data, and it all can help us refine the approach for this person to get them where they want to be. And again, time limitedness, really important. So they go, I'll do it in the next, sometime. You go, no, not sometime. You're going to do it this week, or are we going to give you 2 weeks to do it? So that's you providing the guidance, really maintaining that structure even within the individualization. Okay, so these are the references that I really recommend. The top one, which is the Godley Myers-Smith, 14 other people, that's free on the SAMHSA website. And that will, it's specifically for the treatment of adolescent cannabis users, but the spirit of CRA and what you're doing and the session by session modality is all in there. They give you some scripting, which is very, very helpful. The original book that outlined CRA is the third one down, Myers and Smith, The Clinical Guide to Alcohol Treatment. That's still sort of the seminal text. A little updating with some of the empirical data and validation you'll find in Myers and Miller, which is the one right above it. With regard to craft, which I didn't get to talk about as much as I thought. Funny, this was 30 minutes in my office this morning, but somehow it's 50 minutes. I'm not sure how that happened. Myers and Wolf wrote something called Get Your Loved Ones Sober, Alternatives to Nagging, Pleading, and Threatening. That was written back in 2004, and that is a book that's really helpful to give to significant others about ways to talk differently to their patient. And then the last one, which is Foote, Wilkins, and Kazansky, which is Beyond Addiction, How Science and Kindness Help People Change. That's sort of the next iteration of the information that was put forth in Myers and Wolf. For those of you who are interested in actually the application of craft in your practice, working with the significant others and not the patient directly, there is a manual for providers that is written by Smith, J.E. Smith, and I can't remember what it's called right now, but I know you can find it on Amazon. So that is a whirlwind of CRA that I oftentimes do in a 2-day workshop, and I've tried to give you all in 50 minutes. So we have like 10 minutes. If anybody has specific questions, more than happy to attempt to answer them.